Hello, hi everyone. Today we'll continue explaining a question from the RCSA 10M question bank. Previously, we already covered the first question, which was about modifying the IP and related SH configuration content. Next, let's move on to the second question. The second question actually hasn't changed much either. Why is that? Because later on, we'll need to install a lot of services and software and such, so the first and second questions remain the same. They never change, even if we get to version 20. Trust me, it's always about configuring something. What is it? Configuring our IP, configuring our setting up the repository. Of course, to be precise, by version 18, well, you could call it setting up the repository, meaning either the DNF repository or others are fine. These two, in terms of which command you use, both work the same way. There's really no substantial difference, all right? All right, first let's take a look. For the first question, after we've modified our IP and set up our gateway, we need to restart the network and check the SSH configuration. After that, what can we do next? We can start configuring our repository setup. The main task for this question is actually just about a single file. Once you write that file correctly, that's basically it. Here, actually, because in recent versions, our repository is no longer just one, right? In earlier versions, we only had a single repository. Now, basically, each repository consists of two parts. Or more precisely, there are two directories, whether you're looking at it from the local side or whether you're checking from the local mirror or from the network side. If you look at the official repository, there are actually two components as well. One is the base OS, right? The other is the app stream. So there are two paths in total. Two paths meaning two parts. Our different software packages are all stored in one of these places. And here, because during the exam, it's actually not connected to the internet, it doesn't connect to the official repository. So in the end, what we actually need to pay attention to is this. In the end, what you actually need to configure is the local repository. Of course, this local repository isn't necessarily on server A itself. It's not exactly like that, because in a real environment, there are actually other virtual machines. Which other virtual machines? Other environments as well, including here. In fact, what we ultimately connect to is actually it's essentially an address within the internal network environment. You can think of it as a website. This is the situation. Of course, you definitely have a local one as well, which is the same, because in our exam environment, we can't connect to the internet. Next, let's take a closer look at how to configure this specific question. Actually, if you want to talk about this, if we configure it according to the requirements of the question, what do we actually need to write? We just need to set the base URL properly, and that's enough. If in the question there are specific requirements, right, whatever content you're asked to write, you just write that. For example, if it asks for name, description, enable, and GBT check. For these items like key, if the question requires them, just write them as usual. If there are no specific requirements, the simplest way is to just write the base URL, set enable to 1, and set GBT check to 0. That's actually enough, and this question would be done. If the question specifically requires you to use a certain name, for example, you have to write name. Or if it requires a description, then you need to include a description. If you need to write our key, then your GBT check can't be 0. You need to change GBT check to 1 and then copy the key after key. Just copy it, that's all. Actually, in this sample repository, there are really only two relatively long items. One is the base URL and the other is JBJK. For these two, if they're long, you can just copy them directly. Of course, the prerequisite is that you must have SSH enabled for the first question, and then we need to access it remotely. We use the local machine's SSH terminal to remotely connect to the virtual machine. This way, we can actually work much more efficiently. This makes copying operations much easier. Otherwise, doing everything directly on the virtual machine would be much less convenient. So, next, let's take a closer look at how to edit this. First, the path is fixed. It's etc. dar. As for the file name, that depends on your actual situation. If the question requires you to name it a certain way, follow those instructions. If not, you can just create and edit one as you normally would. That's the case for each one. Everyone, you must pay attention here. Make sure to read each question carefully. Why is that? Because no matter which version it is, there will always be some changes in the questions. Of course, some are major changes, some are minor, and sometimes maybe they've changed one or two parameters or tweaked a couple of minor requirements, nothing that affects the overall situation. Sometimes they might add a question or modify one or two questions. All of these are possible. So next, let's take a closer look. Now, for our second question, how to configure it, actually, it's basically the same as before. What should you pay attention to here? The main thing is, as long as you get the base URL right, there really aren't any major issues with the rest, like the name field, for example, or the description. These don't affect the essence of the problem. In other words, they don't impact the following questions. You can think of it this way. Even if, say, In our second question, there are requirements for these fields, and if you get them wrong, you don't get points. As long as you get the base URL right, the subsequent software can still be installed, so it doesn't affect the later questions. At least it won't impact the following questions. Alright, so next, let's take a closer look at how to properly configure this question. Here, let's go to our remote connection, and first, we'll edit a specific file. Now, the path to this file is fixed. The path is fixed. The file name depends on the situation. Just write it according to the requirements. If there are specific requirements, follow them. If not, you can name it whatever you like. Once you come in here, first, this is actually a template I prepared for you today. What should you pay attention to here? First, regarding the name here, what actually ends up being displayed as the name in our yum repository? It's this one, right? As well as this, meaning both the base OS and our app stream, these two sections. The name here actually isn't important. The name isn't important. What's most important is this line. When we get to this part, to be precise, this should actually be changed to the version. And as for the link in the front, what does it actually represent? It's essentially a local URL for us, a local website, because in our real environment, we can't connect to the internet. So in the end, what we can actually connect to here is just a local one. If we're talking about the environment we're linking to, it's actually just a local virtual machine or another virtual machine. And inside, what is provided to us is a sample environment like this. In the end, there are actually just these two. One is Space OS and the other is our app stream. So in total, what are there? Two of them. The repository paths, or rather the software, are actually placed under these two paths respectively. And next, there's one more thing to pay attention to. Make sure to enable it. Enable must be turned on here. Secondly, regarding the check part, writing it as 0 or 1 is completely different. If it's 0, you can leave out the JBG key. But if it's 1, you must include the JBG key. Actually, as long as the question doesn't specify otherwise, there are quite a few things here that can be omitted. For example, the name can be left out. Right here, actually, I also left out the description field. For a more complete version, if you were to set up a repository, you might need fields like name, description, base URL, enable, key, and check, right? But if there are no strict requirements and we just need to configure a repository like this, then this setup is sufficient. As long as you simply fill in the required name field, set the status to enabled, and check the box, based on all of our past experience, writing it exactly like this is more than enough. With a bit of experience, you will see that this is perfectly sufficient. In many previous versions, writing it this way was also completely fine, and you could easily get full marks without any issues. For this question, you actually don't need any validation. As long as you write the path correctly, save, and exit, and then you can move on to the third question. Because what is the content of the third question? The third question is about configuring SE Linux for our service, right? For this question, the first step is that you need to install the HPD service. So the first operation in the third question is actually to verify whether our repository is correct. So after you finish writing here, you can just save and exit. This is the content of our second question. Actually, you don't need to verify here. You can just move on to the third question. For the third question, just install the service directly and proceed to configure the subsequent content. Later on, I will continue to explain the following questions for everyone. Next, the third question is actually just a continuation of the second one, so let's wrap up here for today. If you're interested, you can leave a comment below to get our latest question bank or just send a private message. Either way is fine. All right, that's it for today. Goodbye, everyone.